My name is Tracy Summers, and I'm a member of the Great Diamond Island Sea Level Rise Partnership. And we put together this Calling Your Bluff project to educate our communities, especially our island communities, about erosion and what's facing our islands, especially in the future. I want to make sure that I thank GP for this, because without this, our webinar would not be possible. And I think, much of what we're doing, these parallel efforts with these organizations and the people that are here now, is to create capacity and regional coordination. It really helps build that knowledge that we need to tackle the subject of shoreline erosion. And I think this really matters because we need that shared knowledge and stronger networks to respond in face of the erosion that we're going to be seeing, especially as our winter storms get stronger, made worse by sea level rise. I want to also say thank you to our presenters for contributing your time and being here today, your expertise. I think especially with the local presentations that you'll be presenting to, will all help us better understand the issues that we're facing with shoreline erosion. And I also want to say thank you to our members of the partnership, especially our island members. We have Long Island, Little Diamond, Chebeague, Peaks. The local work that you've done within this Calling Your Bluff project is what has made it really successful and has really elevated the awareness around our region. And you're essentially laying the foundation for our long-term coastal resilience for our islands. And that's it.
Thank you, Tracy. Hi, everyone, and welcome. So I'm Gretchen Anderson with the Greater Portland Council of Governments. And like Tracy said, we're really excited to be here with Great Diamond Island Partnership, and this collaboration that we're doing, I think, is a great convergence of all the great work that's being done, and we're happy to help. We have 4 presentations ahead, and after all the presentations, we'll have time for some Q&A sections and a panel discussion with all the presenters and some other experts. Before we get started, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. So all attendees are muted for the entire duration of the webinar. You're able to use the chat box to introduce yourself and share resources. Please use the Q&A to submit questions. We'll do our best to address them all once all the presentations are complete. And then if you have any tech issues, message me directly in the chat or email me at ganderson@gbcog.org. And then the link, this webinar is being recorded, and we will hope to have the link for the recording and associated resources to be shared. So now I'm going to pass it over to Pete Slavinsky, who will introduce himself as our moderator before we get started. So Pete, over to you.
Thanks, Gretchen. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Pete Slavinsky, marine geologist with Maine Geological Survey. Been involved in a lot of these education and outreach efforts in conjunction with GDI for a number of years now, and it's a pleasure to be here again. I'm going to serve as some of your content expert and also moderator for the presentations. We're going to have 4 presentations that, like Gretchen said, covering a bunch of some of the different islands and also some of the techniques and projects, case studies, I guess you could call them, that are going to be shared with you. Really provide a great amount of information on ways we can adapt our shoreline to changing conditions specific to coastal bluffs. And then, so as Gretchen said, we're going to have the 4 presentations. Please use the Q&A. And then after that, we're going to have some time for some questions, then go into a panel session. So with that, I don't know who we have up first, Gretchen, for our speakers, but I'll turn it back to you to run the slides, and we'll go with it there, and each speaker will introduce themselves, so we don't spend a lot of time on long introductions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Pete, so much. So first we have Scott Wilson from Little Diamond Island. So take it away, Scott.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Scott Wilson, Little Diamond Island. The storms of December 2022 and January 2024 took their toll on many Little Diamond Island shorelines. Our most severe damage occurred at the beach near the Main State Pier. This photo, taken shortly after the storms, shows the extent of the damage in this area. The erosion of 2024 was 7 times greater in measurement of lost material than that of the December 2022 storm. The erosion at this location had many factors. Here you see the deep scar, largely exacerbated by the adjacent Main State Pier stonework. This is known as end effect erosion. If you look closely at the erosion scarp, you will see a century of history in the layers of soil, including evidence supporting the likelihood that this site was originally a coastal sand dune. 110 feet of shoreline was damaged, and an estimated 224 cubic yards of material were washed to sea. I repeat this image briefly only to highlight the large boulder shown in yellow. You may have noticed this. It will give you a great reference point as I move on to the design approach. The increased wave erosion impact caused by hard armoring with the stone riprap was significant. When storm waves impact such firm obstacles, they must dissipate that wave energy downward, upward, and or sideways. Downward forces undercut the stone wall itself, which has occurred here, and the sideways deflections concentrate the wave energy onto the more vulnerable adjacent soft embankments as shown in blue. I repeat this slide for one purpose. In a moment, I will be showing several cross-section illustrations that cut vertically through the shoreline at a red line indicated by DD. Note the tree trunk at left center. This indicates the first of 3 section studies to address end effect erosion within a designated coastal sand dune. Hoping to restore the island's golf cart parking area while also not using any new stone structures, using living shoreline design principles entirely, the resulting slope of any new embankment would be at about a 1-in-2 pitch, very steep. There are few successful precedents of completed living shoreline efforts surviving storms with this steep of a pitch, especially during the vulnerable early years of dune grass growth, and certainly not under the concentrated end effect wave conditions we experience. In our second study, we lowered the slope of the lowest section of the dune and at the same time increased the slope of the upper dune. This would give the lower dune a better survival chance during routine nuisance high tides, but extremely high tide storms would assuredly destroy the upper dune with a 1-in-1 slope as shown, very steep. If we chose not to restore our golf cart parking, a more gradual toe slope of about 1-in-3 could be achieved, but this is still very steep. So in close collaboration with Maine DEP and the state geologist, we defined a new boundary line that more accurately represents the extent of the sand dune that likely were present prior to 1908. Then a hybrid design could be developed that uses both hard armoring and living shoreline design principles. This new illustration indicates how the hybrid approach not only provides and protects the upper parking area, but it also allows the living shoreline sand dune to be developed at an even lower 1-in-5 slope. This plan and the 2 that will follow help to visualize the components of the design approach. The blue line, which is not shown here, indicate the boundary established to limit the use of stone riprap structures. The new stone wall formation, shown in gray, shifts away from the shoreline while it also is diminishing in height. Behind the new stone wall, we backfilled the large void with drainage stones shown in brown. Then we altered the surface topography to collect rain runoff and discharge it into the stormwater reservoir. This reduces the surface water flowing over and eroding the sand dune itself. And finally, the green area is an entirely newly constructed sand dune built between the stone wall and the beach. To recap, the right-hand plan shows the completed project. Note how the new sand dune becomes considerably wider and taller as it moves to the right, to the northeast. The next slide will show this transition. The sand dune profile at opposite ends of the plan varies considerably in width, slope, and height. As the dune gets higher, the stone wall gradually shrinks. And here is the completed effort. Everyone asks us about the cost for this project. On Little Diamond Island, we budgeted $143,600, and it ultimately cost the island about $146,000. The total cost can be better understood when split between a contract with Lionel Plant Associates of Peaks Island, shown to the left, and the raw materials needed to support an all-volunteer dune building effort. If we add in the value of 800 to 1,000 hours of volunteer time, we should add at least $24,000 and upward to $35,000 to the value of the project for a total completed value of $170,000 to $180,000. So here's how we did it. The all-volunteer dune building effort built everything shown in the green planting plan, the new sand dune. At the toe line of the sand dune, we trimmed and nurtured the surviving woody plants, removing much bittersweet. And at the top of the new dune, we planted new woody plants native to Maine, Rosa virginiana and bearberry. In between, 2,000 beachgrass plugs are planted among 830 linear feet of coconut core logs. In the next 12 slides, we will show you the effort and the results. We took 4 weeks with 4 intense Saturday efforts. The dune building kicked off with a full day of site cleanup and a beach burn. Working from the high water line upwards, we started the toe cell with a more robust 20-inch diameter coconut core log set into an 8-inch deep trench. Note the existing tree trunk logs and rocks have been kept in place to our advantage. On week 2, Lionel Plant began the heavy lifting to build the upper stone wall. Much of the stone you see here will be buried later by the new sand dune. Soon the dune sand and the tiers of core logs began to fall into place. Each of these core logs are secured with 10 oak stakes and tied down with crisscrossed 1/4-inch diameter coconut core twine. As the dune construction continues, 200 yards away, a beach access boardwalk, a footbridge, was being prefabricated. On week 3, we near the top of the dune. Prior to positioning the footbridge, the first of 2,000 plugs of American beach grass are being planted. To efficiently plant 2,000 plugs of beach grass uniformly, we developed our own set of customized tools. Planting directly into the core logs themselves proved to be a particularly stubborn task. Weekend 4, completion nears and the final details are attended to. The last day, the upper dune woody plants of Rosa virginiana and bearberry, both native to Maine, are being planted and then followed by a nourishment with fertilizer and a reliable watering system to give our new dune its best chance for surviving winter number 1. LDI's new sand dune. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. We really appreciate it. So our next presenter is going to be John Lorty, who's going to be talking about Fowler's Beach from Long Island.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit different presentation. We were using much different techniques to kind of manage the beach erosion that we've seen. And I titled this Change Environmental Stewardship and Volunteers. As everyone knows, the only constant is change in these high energy environments. And on Fowler's Beach, that's been the case for sure. And similarly, we have used all volunteers to work on erosion control during almost the past 40 years. So I'm going to go through a little bit of history of what's been done, and then I'm going to show a number of slides depicting the edge of dune, which I marked using Google Earth imagery. And then we'll talk about the last couple of years where the storms have really done a number on the beach. So this is essentially Fowler's Beach. The lower right-hand quadrant shows most of the beach where we have been actively managing for almost 40 years. In 1986, property was given to the Long Island Civic Association, and Oceanside Conservation Trust put a conservation easement on the property, and that dictates what are allowable activities. In 1989 and 90, there was a storm that did a bunch of damage. We hired a consultant, and they recommended doing some planting and installing snow fence. We put in Rosa rugosa, which is now viewed as an invasive species, but back then we didn't know. Put in 300 feet of snow fence and 1,100 plugs of beach grass. And then in 92, we did get an after the fact permit from the DEP. And at that point in time, they were allowing use of snow fence. That's changed since then. And then subsequently in 93, 94, 96, 97, and actually all the way up until 2006, repeated storms would wash out parts of the beach or wash out part of the snow fence, and the snow fence was repaired repeatedly, and beach grass was planted several more times. Rosa rugosa was planted several more times, and for the most part, those efforts were pretty successful. So let's move on to the next slide. And this is what these are going to look like. I'm going to run through the last 27 years. This is 98. Some of the imagery wasn't great in Google Earth, as some of you know. This shows pretty much the extent of the beach. This is 2003. And what I want to point out is where you see Jerry's Point Road on the right side of the photo. I will point, I don't think I can use, oh yeah, can people see my cursor? Probably not. I will talk about the area of beach pretty much just south of Jerry Point Road. Okay, next slide. And you can see in this slide, if you look below Jerry's Point Road, there's a small L-shaped section. Shows up a little darker, but essentially that's the beach grass and the snow fence that was installed. And at that point in time, the snow fence was pretty effective at trapping sand during the northwest storms in the winter, and it allowed the beach grass to grow, and the beach grass really recolonized some of the areas that were formerly eroded. Next. This is a nice shot of 2010. You can see how the beach grass is actually doing quite well. At the thinnest part of the beach, just south of the road, that was mostly Rosa rugosa and actually some bittersweet, but beach grass was doing well. And you can actually, if you look closely, see the snow fence that was put in there as well. Next. Okay, this is 2014, and actually the dune is doing pretty well. It's been well vegetated, and for all intents and purposes, we were very happy because the dune was stable, it was well vegetated, and everything was working. And the sand dune or the edge of vegetation corresponded quite well with where the snow fence was. Okay. Next. And this is 2020, very similar, very little change in dune. It looked pretty good. Next. Okay, this is 2023. In December 2022, we had a severe storm that washed away 15 to 20 feet of vegetation. And it took care of any of the snow fence that was remaining. And that was the first big storm that we had that really had an impact. I want to mention a couple things. In 2021, Oceanside Conservation Trust installed a climate change observatory network monitoring post. And you can go on to Momentum Conservation's website and see the results of that post. Essentially, citizen scientists take photographs from the same viewpoint, and then those are put together in a montage, and you can visually see changes that occur or don't occur over time. And that was a really great tool to have. Next slide. This just shows the 1998 line and the 2023 edge of dunes. You can see there was a bit of difference. You can see where some of the dune that was washed away in that 2022 storm was still present. And in the earlier storm in 1998, you can see how much erosion was there. I bring this up. I talked to some islanders who have been living here for a number of years, and before Jerry's Point Road was actually paved, it was a dirt road. And I've heard anecdotally that the storms would wash across the road. I'm not sure of the frequency, and I don't have any aerial photographs of that, but it was not believed to be that uncommon. Next slide. This slide is it's interesting. It shows all the different layers put together. And while there's a bunch of movement, there really wasn't a lot for the past 35 to 37 years. Next. All of that changed in January of 2024. Again, this was followed the December 2022 storm when we lost 15 to 20 feet. In the January, two storms that came together about 2 weeks apart in January of 2024 did tremendous damage. This was a house on the beach, and the foundation was undermined, and it's been removed since then, but pretty significant scouring. And going to run through the next few slides. The photograph on the left shows Jerry Point Road and shows where the wave energy just washed away almost all the vegetation. The slide on the right shows one of the paths. There were several footpaths from Jerry Point Road down to the beach, and these seemed to act as places where the water was funneled, and there was much more erosion observed in those places. Next. This is a nice drone photo from Christian LaMontagne, and it shows really the extent of the erosion and right next to Jerry Point Road. And if you look at the rack line that you can barely see, that's pretty much where the dune grass used to be. So there were places here where we lost a significant amount of vegetation. Okay. Same thing over to the left. This point typically was well vegetated 30 feet out, and that was all just washed away. Next, just another shot of it, and you can see how much of the dune was lost next to the road, and the town is going to have to face some tough decisions. Next. Yeah, and this just shows where the road is really being undermined. So really, for the last slide, I think, as a town, we're trying to determine where we're going to go. And I think a lot of other islands are facing similar situations. And we're going to have increased frequency and intensity of storms. Sea level is going to continue to rise, and we're going to be charged with reviewing the options that we actually have. Can we relocate the road, abandon the road, install engineered erosion control? And the big question is how do towns prioritize resiliency projects, where nature and budgets control what is feasible? I know on Long Island, we have a number of places where infrastructure is at risk, and we're trying to determine how best to manage that. We're a small town, like many of the islands, and we don't have a huge budget. So we don't know what's going to be feasible. That's a quick snapshot of what we've done on Long Island at Fowler's Beach.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it. Next up, we have Julia Main from FB Environmental to talk about the case study of the hook on Chebeague Island. Take it away, Julia.
Thanks, Gretchen. So like Gretchen said, I work at FB Environmental. I'm a scientist with a background in geology and coastal resilience, but I also grew up on Chebeague, and so I know this particular site really well. So you can go to the next slide. So the site that I'm going to be talking about is called the Hook. It's also called Indian Point. This is what it looks like from above. This is a slightly older photo. It's a regulated sand dune by the state of Maine, and it's also part of the National Coastal Barrier Resource System. So all you really need to know about those two things is that they mean that this is a highly dynamic system. It's not a good place for development, and there are very strict rules that regulate activities on this site. Next slide. So the site is owned by the Indian Island Company, which is a collective of nearby residents and family members. And there's a conservation easement, which is held by the Chebeague and Cumberland Land Trust, which allows for public access on part of the beach. And there is an access road to the beach, and there used to be a parking lot in the dunes, and these were both maintained by the town up until recently. The site itself, it's a super important place for the community as a recreational space, just the natural beauty and the habitat. And so there's a lot of sort of community support and value at this site. And there are also a lot of similarities between the dynamics of the site at the Hook and also Fowler's Beach. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're going through this. Next slide. So what happened here? You can go to the next slide. So like others have said, this is a sandy dune system. It's highly dynamic. It's been shifting and changing for generations. But in the last 5 years, the site has experienced some really significant shoreline change, sort of more so than in recent years. So we're going to start in 2020 as sort of the before times, kind of the baseline for today. And so at this point, there was a little bit of erosion along the road. That's that sort of snowy circle picture right there. You can see there's kind of a little sort of U-shaped erosion along the road, but it was still passable. There was still some dunes kind of between the beach and the roadway. So that's what it looked like then. And then if you go to the next slide, this is basically what it looks like now. This was one of Christian's photos from 2024. And so it's a slightly different scale, but those two arrows are in basically the same locations. So you can see that that footpath that was there is completely gone. The parking lot is completely gone, and the lower portion of the road is completely gone. And then that edge of the dune is sort of feet back from where it was originally, or where it was sort of prior to this. So you can go to the next slide. So these are just some images of what the beach looks like kind of on the ground, just to give you a sense of sort of, what this looks like. And, it definitely looks a little bit different than the sort of sandy beach dune system that it used to look like. Next slide. So everyone else has talked about sort of these severe storms that we had from 2022 through 2024. You all experienced them. What was particularly damaging for this site is that these storms came from the southeast. The Hook is very protected from the northeast. And so the winter nor'easters that we, have historically or have had historically haven't impacted it in the same way, though there has been, as we know, dune erosion during the, winter storms is a natural part of the dune life cycle. But these particular storms were very damaging because of that exposure in particular. And so, oh yeah, okay. And so before these storms actually happened, the town and the landowners had already started to evaluate options for addressing the erosion that was starting to happen along the road. They were considering protecting the road, adapting to the conditions, as well as retreating and adjusting the access. And so the community went through this very difficult multi-year process, decision-making process that was divisive at times. And ultimately, the community decided to abandon the parking lot and the lower portion of the road and retreat from the site. And the beach is still accessible by foot. Oh no, you can stay on that slide. I'll tell you when to go to the next slide. And so the beach is still accessible by foot, but you can't drive a car down there anymore. And during my presentation last summer, I went into a lot of detail about this process. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, you can watch that presentation. But today I'm going to talk more about kind of what things look like now and what retreat and restoration can look like in practice. So now you can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the beach is currently pedestrian access only. So the town is working with the landowners to design new parking at the top of the access road. And that's how people have been accessing the beach really since, I think it was, and someone can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, I think it's since 2022. And the land trust and the landowners are also working on restoration activities on the beach. And so building a new footpath to improve accessibility. And then this spring, they also removed the bulkhead that had been there for years. And that restored the sediment transport to the system, or has restored sediment transport to sort of return the system to kind of a more natural return more natural processes to the system. And what is also kind of interesting about this site is that, and it was actually the town administrator who noticed this, is that in the last few years, the piping plovers have come back to the site for the first time in 40 years or something like that. And it was at the same time that people stopped driving down to the beach, which may just be a coincidence, but it's just kind of interesting and, you know, could be some sort of indication of kind of the new ecological regime that we're in at this site. Next slide. So in terms of costs, each component of this is sort of in the 5-figure range. And so the town is covering the parking, and then the land trust and the landowners are working on those, you know, beach restoration activities. Altogether, the cost for these activities is about $130,000. And so for comparison, back in 2021, the town was told that a seawall type solution that would protect the road on the beach would cost $1 million. And so we're talking an order of magnitude less in terms of costs for the activities that, you know, have ended up happening here. So you can go to the next slide. So this is what the beach looked like in 2024 before the bulkhead was removed. And then you can go to the next slide. And this is what it looks like now after the bulkhead was removed. So it's not that different at this point. You know, they just removed it in March. And so it will be really interesting to see over the summer, now that those sediment transport has been restored, you know, how the system will change and, you know, recover, you know, sort of as the summer progresses. Next slide. So this is a picture of them removing the bulkhead. They also removed those pilings that you can see a little farther down there. So just sort of an example of what this looks like in practice. Pete has said, so you can yell at him if I'm wrong about this, that as far as he knows, this is the only site where, you know, some hard shoreline protection has actually been removed to restore those natural processes. So hopefully we'll see more of that in sites where it's appropriate. But I think it is a pretty interesting case study. Next slide. So as I mentioned, it was really difficult for the community to get to this point with the hook. So I just want everyone to understand that. It was very emotional, and it is still very much in progress. But what I think is exciting is that there has been a sort of mental shift and an embrace of the idea of retreat. So if you go to the next slide, the town has a number of public access points to the shore. And all of these public access points were impacted during those winter storms. And this map shows 2 of those access points. And then the flood zone is shown in blue. And so the town is considering the current access at these sites and potentially retreating from these sites, because there's a recognition that the shoreline is going to continue moving landward. And so now is the time to move our infrastructure out of the way, rather than, kind of waiting for the inevitable. Next slide. So focusing on Sandy Point, this site has a lot of similarities to the Hook. It's a sand dune. It's part of the Coastal Barrier Resource System. There's currently a parking area in the dunes because everyone just wants to park in the dunes apparently, or drive through the dunes. And you can go to the next slide. And so the town is working on plans to retreat here as well, slightly different than the Hook. This would involve getting rid of that existing parking area, relocating it further up the road and have parking kind of along the road parallel. And that would move the parking out of the flood zone, out of the dune, into a less vulnerable area and a less fragile habitat. And then the town has also been exploring potentially doing some active dune restoration in the more degraded areas of the dune itself. And so I think the sort of overall, you can stay on that slide. That was just an additional picture. And so I think the overall takeaway here is that I think retreat is hard, but once we start doing it and people start to understand the benefits, I think it will become easier. And I think it already is starting to become easier as we're seeing more and more examples of this throughout the state. So I'll turn it back to Gretchen.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie, for bearing with me with the controls.
Oh my gosh, no worries. It's part of the deal.
Next up, we have our final presenter, who is Nate Robbins from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, talking a little bit about our shore as well as some case studies. So welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Gretchen. Really appreciate the invitation and thank you for hosting this. It's great to be back and talking about this. Shoreline stabilization is a hot topic, and I'm really just gonna talk about a program we've been developing with a number of partners called Our Shore, nature-based shoreline stabilization practice. It's really about options for stabilization. And I've been asked to talk about how would Our Shore be applied to a site at Great Diamond Island. So in this case, still a site that's under a lot of thought. What is the right solution long-term there? So yeah, next slide, please. So the Our Shore concept is something that actually, in a lot of ways, DEP was asked to sort of step up into this space and help create a program that would connect different shoreline stabilization practices from around the state, so people could learn. As you mentioned, Gretchen, sharing case studies of best practices, and also bringing some of the permitting piece that we have at DEP into the mix, so we can help provide some examples of and sort of the why and rationale about the permitting process, as well as how some of these design practices that work with nature are really using nature-based design practices can work in different environments, and so there's a real call for dynamic solutions in these dynamic environments, and I think folks were sort of talking about that already. So I don't need to delve into that, the importance of that in our sort of shifting coastlines that much more. But Our Shore is also an acronym, so it is, yes, it's Our Shore, and this is really a partnership. We can't really do this alone. The regulations, just speaking from I think DEP's perspective, are only so far reaching. I know it feels like they're everywhere, but there's a lot of activities that are happening around the state that we evaluate proposals, and so the Our Shore program is really about getting out in front of some of the application process and informing that. And so this is really a method for looking at the sources of erosion and arriving at different nature-based design techniques. So Our is design goals and objectives. It's really before even you know, deciding what to do at that site. It's about looking at it and looking at its natural geology, its natural ecology. What are the plants there? What are the different species? And looking at the hydrology and trying to match the design in a way that'll meet those conditions for a longer term naturalized shoreline over time. And then the SHOR is the process for assessing those sources of erosion. And finally, after you sort of look at the sources of those sources of erosion from sort of a lower or a medium or a higher energy contribution, determining erosion control practices that can reduce those, with the idea of using the least amount of intervention needed, and then sort of maintaining that over time. So, going to apply ORSHOR to the site here at Great Diamond. Really, we're looking at the whole site. So instead of just stabilizing the bank, really looking at practices that'll look at the overland, the upland areas all the way down to the water. So, you know, answering questions like what's on the land, what is the land use, how, you know, how much impervious surface is there versus vegetation, how tall and steep is the slope, is it a 1-to-1, is it a 3-to-1, what's happening at the bottom, is there undercutting there under the trees, and is there groundwater seepage that's coming out of the bank, and how big are the waves and the currents that are contributing to the erosion at the toe. So from a site history standpoint, you know, there's I'm not from there, although I did get to go out there and I did get to see the site. So there were previously a lot of trees on the bank. I know there's some has been converted to grass. It gets saturated during rain events. Yes, there's some pooling of water. Right now, it's looking like you know, I think there was some overtopping, close to overtopping of the storm surge of waves, but really that you know, it's kind of right on the edge now at that point in terms of its risk. So you can see the rack line is already getting up on the road where the pier is hitting the land there. Not currently reaching the restaurant. We'll show some photos of that in a second. But also that there's a historic seawall there that started to fail in the early 2000s. So we can see some toe erosion evident. And then in response to the 2024 storms, there was some emergency stabilization. So at the time, DEP can authorize, and we still do, temporary stabilization for up to 7 months. So that's what's in place right there. Next slide, please. So just breaking it down a little bit. So at site A, you can see there's a pretty steep slope there. There's some tall trees. There's not a whole lot of understory. So there's a lot of opportunity for overland erosion from rain. Similarly, down the road there, down into the lawn. So there's a lot of opportunity for rain to sort of concentrate into rills and sheet flow, which could create some erosion over the top of the bank. And then from that picture earlier, you could see that there was some exposure really to the cove as well from the ocean side. And you can see in that picture on the light, you can see some of the debris that starting to get washed up from that last storm in January of 2024. Next. Moving around, so there's the restaurant, and there's some homes down there a little bit farther behind the trees there. You can see some quite a bit of erosion that happened from over time. And then if you just go one more, we can look at the current. You can see on the some of the emergency stabilization that was done at the site, all that stone that's right on the bank, and then also you can see the eroding wall, the seawall that's been there. It's starting to erode at the toe. Next. Similarly, moving down the site, this is actually left a little bit more natural. There's quite a bit of trees, so you do have a little bit mixture of some understory and some taller trees, mature trees on that bank. Next. So using ORSHOR, really, this is just a figure that was taken straight from the ORSHOR guide, which is really emphasizing hybrid solutions. So in this case, you could see at the site there's a lot of rock already there. So matching that natural conditions, it would make sense in a lot of cases to put rock there, especially at the toe. And that would help probably stabilize the slope in the longer run. However, the vegetation is really, really important, especially to treat some of those overland contributions to erosion from precipitation. We've also seen lessons learned around the state from the last storms in January of 2024. I keep saying last, but those significant storms, I should say, where we saw a lot of overtopping cause failure of walls, and especially in cases where they didn't have vegetation at the top of the wall. So we've been encouraging, thinking about bringing vegetation down in the overland and down the slope sort of as far as possible. And so that's might be a strategy to implement here. From a regulatory standpoint, we really do look at the destruction of habitat and trying to really minimize that in terms of any stabilization project. And we also look at adjacent impacts so energy deflection, which we know walls can create. So from a regulatory standpoint, nature-based solutions are really effective at minimizing the impacts to the environment and to adjacent properties. But here's two pictures of examples where you have side by side, you have sort of a more vegetated solution or hybrid solution or more riprap. And you can see, I think for me, the takeaway is that both designs really seem to work well. So why not go with a hybrid design that can give environmental benefit and performance at the same time? And there's really some no regret strategies. I mean, plants, you want to start early. So, the idea is to, increase buffer vegetation, minimize lawns to your banks, put in meanders through the buffer. And there's just no better time to start than now and get those. And you can actually go to the next slide here because you really want to get roots growing. If we think about stabilizing soils, it's really important to get roots into the soil. That's really one of the best ways to do that. And what we found in our research too is that native species have the deepest roots. So we have an opportunity to use natives and to help stabilize our soils. Thanks. And it doesn't have to be this robust of a understory and ground cover and tree layers, but that might be an outcome to achieve, and I think it's really beautiful. But even some sort of hybrid, even if you have some lawn in there, I think just bringing in more vegetation to the site can be really, really helpful, and it's what the Arshore approach would really, I think, recommend, as an outcome if you did a site assessment. And again, you're really building soil, which is going to get those roots even deeper and more established. We've even learned of lessons where trees and shrubs would really fail in the last storms in January of 2024, but then they've already started to come back. And I think one of the takeaways is that the damage could have been even worse without those plants. So, work with nature instead of against it. Next. And here's just some examples. Here's sort of a lower to medium energy environment, coastal environment, just really minimal techniques to just plant. There's some pinned logs there, some cord, there's some access stairways to still get down to the resource. So, and this was just keeping the existing vegetation and adding to it. Another couple pictures here in the next slides. Here's some sills. So this was actually building down into the resource, again, pinning logs and planting some grasses. And the stabilization really only went about halfway to 2/3 up the bank. So didn't ultimately even need to stabilize the entire bank in this case. Next. Same site, also just some, instead of removing what might be considered hazardous trees, they actually pinned under the tree. They actually did some packing of those undercuts with core material to keep those trees there. Next. And just again, more examples. And just to point out that, these are also citizen science projects or things that we need to come together around and plant. Next. Cost was already mentioned. I think one of the couple of big takeaways for us on cost was the biggest way to reduce cost is to minimize the amount of intervention. And by using these more specific, like nature-based techniques or in combination with structural techniques, you really can do that. Looking at some literature, we found that the average cost is around $200 to up to $3,000 per linear foot for nature-based techniques. They go much higher than that for structural. They can also fall in the middle of that range for structural, but just on a linear foot basis, we are finding that, you know, nature-based design techniques or hybrid are lower cost. And that includes in maintenance of less than $200 to $500 per linear foot per year. And you can look at sources like the Vermont Bioengineering Manual. Massachusetts has a storm guidance. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has some guidance on this as well. I think we were happy to see that in Maine, we're seeing costs fall within those ranges, and we already heard a couple of examples of that on the middle to the lower end of that range. Next. And here's the big news is we just adopted new rules for shoreline stabilization in Maine for our permit by rule process, Chapter 305 and for Chapter 310. I think the big takeaway is that this will allow more nature-based design practices to be that were currently under individual permits to be under permit by rule. And this will allow some fill in the wetland and coastal wetlands up to 400 square feet. It'll also allow elevation of stabilization to 1 foot above the BFE. So there's some opportunities to go a little higher, to go in the water, which as we know is really important for the performance side of nature-based design techniques. And we don't have an effective date on that, but that should be coming hopefully in the next month or a little bit more. So permitting takeaways for the site. It will require an individual NRPA permit. This is not uncommon we had a lot of temporary emergency stabilization done in response to some of the larger storms we've had. This one will require an individual NRPA for longer term permanent stabilization. We'd really encourage minimizing hard structures and considering a hybrid design. There's opportunities maybe to do some vegetation, especially maintaining soils and above undercuts that we'd encourage maintaining a vegetative buffer and planting additional vegetation in the buffer. We got a great list of plant species from Gary Fish, who's the state horticulturalist who I know who went out and looked at the site as well. And so there's some great opportunities for vegetations and specific species to use. Just to encourage caution if removing trees. One thing that might be done is pruning of limbs. If you're looking to establish plants that need a little bit more sunlight, you can do shadier plants, but you can also do pruning and get some light penetration for planting if you want to keep those trees. And just not to remove the roots systems of these trees. They're really important in stabilizing the slope. That the design, again, you can think more about in-water practices now. And also just wanted to point out that that site that I showed with some sills that might be appropriate. Next. We have a shoreline stabilization guidance page, our shore page coming soon. So more on that and just additional resources and my contact information and some colleagues at DEP, or you can always talk to the Bureau of Land Resources. Thanks.
All right, thank you all for the presentations. So before we get to the panel, which Pete is gonna thankfully navigate us through, Ben or Jane, do we have any questions for the presenters?
There are a couple that haven't been answered already. One is for Scott about whether your budgeting and your work for Little Diamond Island, did you include anything regarding future damage? And while you're thinking, Scott, I'll let Julia know there's also a question about what level of consideration is being given to ensure access for fishermen and people who need access to the water as the city of Chebeague and folks who own land are thinking through retreating or not.
Okay, so I think the short answer, Ben, is that we have not budgeted any money for potential damage. We do feel that we have a reasonable high level of confidence that if there is future damage from the next storm, it will be to the dune itself, and that the heavy rock structure behind the dune will protect the infrastructure of the island, the street behind it, and the parking area. But we're particularly confident that we're going to have a good survival rate, because our toe slope for all of our dunes is in the 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 range, which is particularly low. Even a lot of the images that Nate showed, they're up in the 1 in 2 and even 1 in 1 slope, which means that the dune is being forced into taking a lot of impact. So I think our dune is as close to being a natural formation as we could imagine. But the short answer is no, we have not budgeted additional money.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I can take that one about fishing access. And so, yeah, it's definitely something the town is thinking about. And access for the fishermen would certainly still be maintained at that site. It would maybe look a little bit different than it does now, but that's certainly an important part of the conversation.
Great. Hearing none, I think we can jump into panel. Pete.
Thanks, Gretchen, and thanks to all of our speakers. I'm giving you digital applause for highlighting a bunch of case studies. I mean, some really great examples of ranges of solutions. From everything from observing and almost basically doing nothing to de minimis and lightly permittable activities on Long Island, to a really hybridized shoreline stabilization in both the dune and bluff environment that Scott shared with us on LDI, to a case study of retreat on Chebeague, and then finally, getting a look at some of those techniques and things we need to consider when we're actually coming up with how do we respond to the drivers of erosion. So with that in mind, I wanted to reintroduce the panel again, and our panel today is going to include our speakers. So Scott, John, Nathan, and Julia, and we're also going to be adding Abby Roche from the Island Institute to our panel list. And I do have some questions for the panel that I'd like you to each kind of consider. These are a little bit more focused towards some of the case studies that we heard about. But the first question that I wanted to ask is, were existing regulations, so when I mean that, I mean both local, state, and federal regulations, flexible or limiting in allowing the solutions that the community chose? So if it's okay, I'd like some of the panelists to kind of tackle that question, and then I have a follow-up to that.
Well, I'll jump in. I know for Long Island, when the initial snow fence was put in, it was put in without a permit. So, but we did file for an after the fact permit and receive that. With that said, we believe that the snow fence was effective in trapping sand during the winter when the northwest winds blow pretty hard. And we now are aware that you can't use snow fence under NRPA, or is not recommended. And so that's something that I think we're going to have to see how we address that. So I'm not sure I have an opinion on how friendly or not it is, but it's a hurdle that we're going to have to get over that we didn't used to have to.
So if I can jump in, Pete, okay?
Yes, please, Scott, go ahead.
So on Little Diamond Island, we originally tried to do a permit by rule, and only to discover that we were classified as a coastal sand dune system. And then the current regulations prior to the changes that Nathan has outlined put us into a individual tier 3 permit process. and the individual tier 3 process is significantly more challenging than a permit by rule. But the old regulations were pretty stringent about what you could and could not do in a coastal sand dune. And the challenge for us was when there is man-made end effect erosion in a coastal sand dune, how do you address that? And it was with a lot of help from Pete and Nate, the other state geologist, we kind of looked practically at the on-site situation and developed the hybrid that I presented and that we ultimately built, that allowed us to do more hard armoring as was required to preserve the island's infrastructure, but then maximize the amount of living shoreline. So if I understand it correctly, Nate, the new regulation would have actually embraced that approach, but for us, we had to kind of negotiate it with DEP. And at the end of the day, it was quite a nice collaboration. But in the beginning, until we really got talking face to face, it was a bit of a struggle.
Nathan, did you want to comment at all about some of the newer flexibilities that might be in the changes to the regs?
Yeah, and feel free to jump in too, Pete. I know you're an expert. Yeah, I mean, I think, Scott, unfortunately, that probably is the case, that it would have fallen under a permit by rule. And I think that's, you know, the unfortunate and I guess fortunate thing that's going forward, right, is that we did it. You know, it took a while. We did revise these shoreline stabilization regulations to really encourage nature-based practices, and there are a lot of projects that went forward first that informed how we could best, you know, accommodate the types of practices and get the, you know, the largest number of those practices in under permit by rule as possible with these revisions. Obviously, there's some size thresholds as well, but I think just thinking about that project on Little Diamond Island, I think it would have fallen under the PBR going forward. We really did, you know, include biodegradable materials in for sand dunes back in PBR 16, and then there's some new amendments to. We created a 16A for beach nourishment and sand dune restoration and construction activities, which also will accommodate a lot of practices. Yeah, just specifically about dunes, we can keep going about the rest of the what the regulations will do, but another thing we heard that was, I think, a big one that I mentioned already was just allowing some more in-water work. So for coastal, that's 400 square feet under the PBR threshold, 125 linear feet for the size of projects, and coastal, you know, for coastal bluffs. Obviously, sand dunes are still a little bit more restricted, but there's still quite a bit of opportunities under 16 and 16A.
Thanks, Nathan. Julia, did you want to mention anything about how regs
Sure.
kind of drove your project, and whether or not any permits were needed also for like removal of the bulkhead walls and anything else that the town is considering doing there?
Yeah, the regulation, because this site is a sand dune system, like you know, like others have said, the regs were pretty restrictive in terms of, you know, the types of protection that could have been built along the roadway that was eroding. So that was definitely an important part of the decision-making process. Also, the coastal barrier resource sites, you can't use any federal funding to build sort of hard structures, you know, hard shoreline protection structures in those sites. So I think when people started to understand that also helped kind of, you know, sort of influence the decision-making process. For the bulkhead removal itself, I know that one of the challenges was that they were trying to get the work done before March, because, you know, from March to October, they wouldn't be able to, for this particular year, they wouldn't if they didn't do it in March, they wouldn't be able to remove it until October. And so they wanted to, remove it so that it could recover over the summer. And sort of see how things change there. There's also, because there's plovers there, the plover, whenever there's plovers around, and as I'm sure a lot of people know, your activities are very restricted. And so there was an urgency to get it done. In terms of permitting, my understanding is that there was certainly no individual permit that was needed. And I don't believe that even a permit by rule was required based on the recommendation from DEP. So I guess this was considered de minimis. I was actually sort of surprised by that. I would have, and I didn't do the permitting. This is just, sort of from my understanding of the project. I would have expected that you would do a permit by rule for this type of activity. So, definitely if you have any thoughts on that, Nathan, or any, wisdom, please share. There was a shoreline zone permit that was required, not surprisingly. And I know there was some challenges with that because the activities that were in the permit, as they were working on it, the activities they needed to remove it were sort of different than what was in the permit. And that caused some confusion, I suppose you could say. And the code enforcement officer was not particularly pleased about that. And so I would say to anyone who is looking to do something like this is, if your activities do change based on your permits, that you should talk to the regulators that you're working with, and, kind of work through some of those problems with them. Yeah, so that's kind of the long answer.
No, that's great. Thank you. And that gets me this discussion kind of leads me to the next question I wanted to ask the panel, which is, besides regulations, what were some of the other key factors that influenced the community or stakeholders' decisions in making the resilience decision that they did? So I'm going to throw that back out to the panel. And ask folks to please step up and.
Yeah, no, I'll jump in again. I think from our standpoint, the, beach is a very valuable resource. It's highly used, throughout the year, mostly during the summer when people are there, and keeping that resource available is very important. And then the road does lead to 4 different residences, and so it's very important to have access because of that. So it was really a no-brainer for us to put, some money and a lot of volunteer effort into maintaining and restoring the site.
I'll try to answer this as simply as I can. In our case, the island was pretty much stunned, shocked. What doesn't show in our presentation was that the storm also took out about 4 feet of the access roadway at the end of the pier. So for about a 6-month or 7-month period, we had to walk across the gangway to get from the state pier onto land. And the erosion was so serious that where we had always traditionally parked the golf carts, as you know, Little Diamond is a golf cart only community, where we would park golf carts and garden tractors, that area had been completely made unsafe. Over the course of the first 6 or 7 months after the January 24 storms, the erosion continued to undercut the bank and got within 5 feet of our main access road. So there was like, oh my God, what do we do? On Little Diamond Island, as many of you probably know, the casino and the beach that we've been speaking about are very much the living room and playground in the center of the island community. And it's not our beach use on a sunny summer day is 30, 40 people all crowded down there in a very large community activity. So there was a lot of concern over losing this precious asset to the entire island. So I inherited the challenge of trying to figure out what our options were. There were a few people on the island that said we can't fight Mother Nature, just let it go. There were other people on the island that said let's restore it, but let's eliminate golf cart parking altogether and completely let the embankment naturalize. So took a lot of behind the scenes discussions back and forth to figure out what the best compromise was. And all of that was happening concurrently with working with DEP and Pete Slinsky and Nate Whitehead, right, Nate or Pete, to come up with a practical solution. And we ended up where we were. I think it took a fair amount of education on my part to help everybody understand natural forces and what they do to the beaches and what we could and could not expect, and what the probability of success would or would not be.
Thanks, Scott. Julie, is there anything you wanted to answer or add? I know you could probably take a whole session talking about the other factors that influence Chebeague's decision, but if you want to touch on that real quick, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, honestly, I think it was pretty similar. I think that piece that Scott was just talking about, particularly Pete, your involvement in coming out to the community and talking about the science of these systems, I think people help to understand the benefits of using a more nature-based solution as opposed to, a hard infrastructure solution. Certainly cost, regulatory considerations. But I think a big part of it was understanding that by protecting or continuing to protect the road, that was actually having negative consequences on the beach, eroding the beach. And so it was sort of this trade-off of losing vehicle access to the site, but protecting the beach and allowing sort of natural systems to continue at the beach rather than kind of ending up with a low tide only kind of beach face. So yeah, I think that's it for now.
Thanks. The last panel question that I had kind of builds off of that a little bit. And it's really a kind of a wide net that I'm throwing here. And this is also for some of our other panelists who haven't spoken yet. So please pipe in here. But what do you think are some of the biggest needs for communities moving forward as it relates to furthering what we're talking about here?
Can I go?
You may.
When we tackled this, I joked that I certainly didn't know what a coconut core log was, and I certainly didn't understand end effect erosion. And it took a lot of research and a lot of just digging and digging and digging to find the resources. And I noted that Nathan talked about the Vermont guidebook, and Massachusetts has some guidebooks, and I actually found a ton of information from the state of Washington, a lot of information from North Carolina, and I think it would be extremely beneficial if the state had the resources to publish a book of legitimate design guidelines, illustrations, recommendations. When you talk about living shoreline, it's a definition that it varies from state to state, and it may not be applicable in all situations. And some of it can be very expensive, and some of it can be extremely affordable. So more like, what would the old Farm Bureau do to help a farmer figure out what to do if this was on their farm? So I think that would be really beneficial.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, Scott, for sure. And the other source of information is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Waterways Experiment Station in Vicksburg, Mississippi. They've been real leaders for decades now in reconstructing living shorelines, primarily in riverine environments, but also in coastal environments. And they have a pretty significant body of work that from all published research papers, and they have some publications that have assembled that. But I think you're right. A lot of local communities are really at the very beginning of knowledge. They just don't know where to start with these projects. And the other thing is right now there's a real lack of good coastal engineers that are available. Everyone that's out there is absolutely buried.
Yep.
I can jump into, hi everyone, my name is Abby Roach. I work at Island Institute. And in response to Pete's question, and also just hearing all this great work today, one of the things I would highlight that needs to continue happening is grassroots efforts like the ones we're seeing today, and the community work that's happening in Casco Bay to continue happening. And I mean, just to shine a light on all of these folks and some of the folks who are behind the scene, who are kind of fielding the questions here in the Zoom. There's a lot of leaders in Casco Bay who are actively thinking about nature-based strategies and solutions and how to consider them in a municipal context and also for private landowners. And I think continued space for people to share approaches just like this one today, and also talk about potential regional approaches. The other thing that I would say that is continuing to be important is getting folks with expertise out on the ground. Something to kind of build on some of the things that Nathan talked about is DEP and Maine Conservation Corps have a new program called Shore Corps Steward program, and these stewards are able to go into communities and use the Our Shore guidance to assess shoreline vulnerabilities and offer technical support. And Island Institute will be hosting a Shore Corps Steward starting in May, and that person will be spending some time in Casco Bay among Great Diamond Island, Little Diamond Island, Cliff Island, Peaks Island, Chebeague Island, and Long Island. And so I think just more opportunities for folks to get out on the ground, socialize nature-based solutions, and see demonstration projects like the ones that are happening on Little Diamond Island. Also very important.
Thanks, Abby. That's a great point.
Yeah, Pete, could I just jump in? I just wanted to mention one other really good resource. It's the Society of Wetland Scientists, an international organization now. They have published a tremendous amount of work on wetland restoration, both freshwater and coastal, and they're a great resource for people.
Julia or Nathan, you want to jump in?
Go ahead, Nathan.
Sure, yeah. And I think I missed a couple of questions that came in while I was responding in the chat, but so I just want to go back. Julia, it was interesting to hear your comment about permitting, because I think that is what, it is counterintuitive sometimes when you're removing structures that the permitting threshold is lower or there is no permit. And so it's sometimes opposite of what people would think, because it's a big, activity in the resource. So, we continually try to message on that, removing structures is actually from a, where we're looking at environmental, protection. That's sort of the one of the best outcomes for the environment, right? Is the removal of the structure. So we see that in sand dunes for homes when people are looking to, remove their home, or even to elevate. Elevate could be done on our PBR, but if you want to stabilize, it's going to be, PBR or an individual. So, sort of the opposite direction of what often property owners would think of, right, in terms of their activities. So, removal being a lower threshold, elevating being in the middle, PBR or permit by rule, or stabilizing being individual or permit by rule. I mean, I think that the other, just to your question too, Pete, was, yeah, like just the outreach. I know someone added the link to the Our Shore page. That's just our draft page. You can go on there, and the guide from the Our Shore guide from November is up on that site. You can access it there. We're trying to get it sort of a more formal launch of that page with the newest guide out in the next few weeks. That's our goal anyway. So we were just responding to some of the comments that we got from partners around the state, and really just trying to build this community of practice as we shift. I mean, I think even down to the terminology living shorelines that was mentioned, we've heard that that's a really difficult term to engage with. So we've been trying to focus on the different erosion control practices and just the types of materials that people are using, like coconut fiber, and then how is that actually applied in the landscape on lakes or rivers or in coastal bluffs or sand dunes. And so I'm just trying to give more information, make the information more readily available. We heard that there's just a huge volume of information. And one of the big goals for this Our Shore program is to just communicate that more easily. Like, we keep thinking about the well of information being deep, and we just need help people to understand, like, you can come to the well, you can have a sip, and then you can get to the engineering manual that Vermont has, or all of these other great resources. So we're just trying to add that entry point for folks to learn about these practices. So that's what one of the biggest barriers that we've heard from a regulatory standpoint is just get more guidance out around the practices and how people are using them. And then the more we can do it for Maine, the better, because we have tidal ranges that are really high. We have ice. So we just have different environmental conditions. But there is a lot of work even going on in the Canadian provinces, Eastern Canadian provinces, and the Great Lakes that are dealing with similar issues successfully with nature-based design techniques.
So I can follow up on that, because I think what I have to say is kind of similar. And actually, I saw someone mentioned in the chat that they actually did get a PBR for removing the wall. So I misspoke there. So I think that makes sense. That's what I would have expected.
Typically, we do
so anyways,
about the activity of the work and just like, how much
right.
equipment's going to be moving around, especially.
And I mean, and I think just a good reminder that this is always very site specific too. And I basically would sort of, agree with that that sort of generally. I think even more specifically, helping people, specifically homeowners and residents, understand when riprap is the sort of best and only solution for their conditions, for protecting their home, for protecting safety, and when it's maybe not the best option, and might actually be detrimental to, their either their property or to the habitat. And I think that after the storms, people panicked, which is totally understandable. I mean, I think I panicked myself, and we saw just like a slew of riprap projects, sort of come through the hopper. And, I think a lot of those maybe need to happen. I certainly, in my own work, this is something we've been talking a lot about with people, is sort of evaluating whether that is the best option, or if there are alternatives that they can look at that might actually address the issues that they're experiencing more effectively. So, I think that's something that everyone has talked about, but I think really specifically kind of, providing that guidance to people will be really helpful. I think funding is also a huge thing, which we sort of talked about some. I think LD1, which is going to be providing some, I think it's loan, I don't know if it's grants or loans, I think, to homeowners for increasing resilience. I think that's going to be such an awesome program. And so I hope that, that will continue. And so I guess that's the two that I would say is evaluating riprap as an option versus nature-based solutions, and then funding.
That's very helpful, Julia, and good addition. I'm surprised we need a dedicated resource for shoreline stabilization / living shorelines hybrid project funding for private property didn't come up. So I know that's something that's been talked about. You mentioned LD1. I put a reference to it in the chat for people to see. That does have some funding in there for a range of different activities. Only a little bit is dedicated to private property. I know we want to make time for questions for other folks that they may still have. The last thought I have here is in several of the projects that John shared and Scott shared, there was a big focus on volunteer labor and getting folks out to help with these things. So, the Shore Stewards Program, I think the applications are closed for 25 or for this upcoming year. Having volunteers participate in these projects is key in getting people to be interested in what's going on, but also to lend a helping hand. So, great conversation with everyone, and I want to turn it back to Gretchen to make sure we have time to answer some questions from other folks in the audience if they have any.
Definitely. So I don't know if Ben or Jane has any other questions that we're seeing. I did see Ellen's hand raised at some point. I didn't know, Ellen, if you wanted to come off mute to have a question or a comment.
To come on, but you've shut me down. The video.
Oh, apologies. One second. Let me.
It was just an add-on to Scott, who is, a real hero on LDI. I think one of the things he neglected to say in his intro was that he was a longtime architect who had fortuitously just retired and was looking for a project. And he put something like 1,000 hours into coming up with a plan, which was phenomenal. But I think another really key piece to Pete's question about what were the key factors that influenced the community in making our decision was the trust in Scott, because we were really relying on him to do this amazing amount of information gathering and design something that was unbelievably complex. And because of the very high social capital within Little Diamond Island and the trust in Scott, people supported it. Not everybody, there was some concern about money. And to your final question, Pete, about what do we need? These projects are really expensive and not everybody can afford them. So money would be a big one.
Thanks, Ellen.
Yes, thank you, Ellen, and for bearing with the technicalities. Tracy, it looks like your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Scott's point on the lack of available resources. And one of the things I hear when people are considering nature-based solutions is like, oh yeah, we consider that, but we went to a contract consultant, and this is what it's going to cost just for us to get an idea of what that entails. And most of these people, when they go into this, they have no concept of what nature-based solution is, as Scott mentioned all the research that he had to do. And I'm wondering if there's a way to bridge that gap where consultants are kind of holding on to that information because it's part of their process of creating money for them. They have to make a living, and yet we really do need to have that availability to at least jumpstart discussions in going in that direction, because most people just turn back to hard armoring as a solution.
It's also worth noting that there are, to the best of my knowledge, only a handful of contractors that would do a living shoreline, because one, they don't know how, and two, they're not going to take on the liability if it doesn't survive. So I think the do-it-yourself volunteer process takes away some of that risk, but it's very difficult to figure out how you would actually execute it on your own without good guidelines, sketches, illustrations, plant list, specific I've took me the longest time to find out how do you tie down a core log, right? Just eventually I found a state of Washington forestry department diagram of how to get down a core log.
Yeah, I think you're right, Scott. I think the Our Shore document came out a little bit late for your project, but there, the final document will have a lot of information on different techniques, how to employ them, what are some resources to turn to, et cetera, et cetera. So a little bit late, but so you guys were ahead of the game on that, unfortunately, I guess.
But I'm looking at the logs in your screens, your background, Pete, that are sort of used to stabilize the shore. And, I didn't know that was beneficial until someone pointed it out to me that the logs that drift up into our beach could be used to benefit, so because they act in the same capacity as the snow fence does. The sand blows behind them and builds up the dune. So all that stuff is very beneficial. Instead of dragging it out or burning it and trying to get rid of it on your beach, how do you stake it down so that it stays there? How to do it. That's a volunteer thing.
And you get into, some de minimis activities is reusing driftwood, but as soon as you talk about anchoring techniques, if it's biodegradable, it's allowable under permit by rule. But if it's not biodegradable in a dune system, then it goes into an individual permit. You start bringing up the complexity of these things, and also the kind of proprietary techniques that some consultants use to do this stuff, which isn't well known around all of Maine. So I just want to ask Gretchen, how are we doing on time for things here?
We are quickly approaching the end.
Okay.
I don't believe there are any more questions. Tracy, I didn't know if you wanted to pass it over for any last words or any additional updates before we end.
Nope. I do see there's a question from Diane Watts. I don't know if anybody wants to answer that, but before I say goodbye.
I believe Pete
okay.
provided some follow-up for the Conservation District, and then I'm also going to be providing specific email contacts in the district that they could reach out to. Okay,
great. So I just want to thank everybody who's here, and Pete especially for moderating this this webinar, and Ben and Jane for behind the scenes with the Q&A. I think we're going to take some of these questions and put them on an online document for people to review that were in the chat that weren't answered live. And we do have a couple of some workshops that are coming up for the individual islands this summer. So you got to keep appraised from that from your island. And that's pretty much it. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
And then Abby, I didn't know if I hate to put you on the spot, but great work you're doing with resilient communities and the Main Island project. Just maybe a little bit of context. I know we're running up on time, but I wanted to allow you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to share that. Recently, Island Institute with several of the island communities here today. So Casco Bay Islands were awarded a Casco Bay Estuary Partnership grant. This grant is aimed to support the ongoing work, just like this today, to continue it going. And so soon, folks in this community, you'll learn more soon, but we will be hosting some more educational events, have opportunities to connect with the Shore Corps steward who will be working with DEP and Maine Conservation Corps with the Our Shore information, and also have some opportunities to have some office hours, as we're calling them, to connect with others in the Casco Bay region to learn about approaches and share different thoughts. Thanks, Gretchen.
Thank you, Abby. And then Tracy?
Yes. So Abby, also you have the what is it called? The Casco Bay Collaborative that you've just announced that kind of points towards the nature-based solutions and how that capacity and collaboration around our region is going to be hugely helpful to our communities.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much, Tracy. And the name of the project, yes, is the Casco Bay Resilience Collective, and that is the work that's funded by the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, and really is all about sharing and connecting across these communities for continued understanding around some of these different approaches. And so more to come, and thank you for the shout out, Tracy.
Awesome. So hearing none, and you know, all the congratulations in the chat. Thank you all presenters, moderators, GDI, everyone for making this happen, and look forward to the resources and the recording. So thank you all and have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.